Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, it is a great honor for me to speak at the plenary session of the 13th International Meeting of High Representatives on Security Issues, and to share the assessments of our ministry on how we work in connection with the ongoing dynamic processes in the world. We work in accordance with the instructions given by the President of the Russian Federation, in accordance with his assessments and instructions. I am glad that your forum, which has already become a tradition and is of great interest all over the world, even among those who are not represented here, maybe it is even more interesting for them than for many others, because it reflects the objective historical tendency of the world's majority countries to have an additional understanding of the need to defend their legal place in international relations. In this hall, there are numerous representatives of the countries of the Global South and the Global East. The voice of these countries is getting louder and louder when discussing the solutions to the most acute and key problems of the modern world. And this fact reflects the true tectonic shift that has taken place in international politics and continues to take place in international politics in recent years. This is, first of all, an acceleration of the processes of the formation of a multipolar world order, a process of redistribution of power balances in favor of new centers of development on the Eurasian continent, in Africa, Latin America. These new objective realities have begun to be recognized wonderfully in the West. In fact, the other thing is that instead of taking into account this objective historical tendency in America, and especially in Europe, there are still many people who see the multipolarity as not a good thing, but a challenge, and even a threat. A threat to the notorious order based on the rules that the West is trying to establish after the end of the Cold War in its selfish interests. For unwise purposes, the international community is forced to imagine that the multipolar world is almost chaos and a struggle of all against all. We cannot agree with such interpretations. They do not reflect the real situation. We consider such approaches of the West to be inconsistent with reality. For example, the West constantly promotes the thesis of inevitability, rivalry, and even clashes of great powers. This thesis does not withstand verification in accordance with reality. Take the relationship between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China, two great neighbors. The relationship is developing dynamically, and according to the leaders of China and the Russian Federation, is in the best condition in its many centuries of history. And in terms of quality, they are a much more advanced form of interaction than the classical alliances of the past era. Another example is Russia's particularly privileged strategic partnership with another great civilization of Eurasia, India. It is a mutually respectful, mutually beneficial, and trustworthy relationship, typical of the relations of my country with other states and participants of the BRICS, and cooperating with this union by many dozens of countries of the Global South and the Global East. The BRICS serves as an example of constructive multilateral interaction of major world players and their partners representing various continents, cultures, and religions. The explanation was confidently approved as one of the pillars of the multilateral world, a guide to the interests of the world's majority on the international arena. The key to peace and stability in the multilateral world is the emphasis on international law, on the ideals of equality and good neighborliness, on the principles of mutual respect and consideration of interests. If we talk seriously about the stability of the world system, a lot will depend on whether the West will be able to get rid of its destructive, ideological, illegal institutions and begin to conscientiously abide by the principles of the UN Charter, to abide by their completeness and interrelationship, and not as they used to do in Europe and the United States, believing in their own exclusiveness and inviolability. In the conditions of multilaterality, the transparency of the founding fathers of the UN, who laid the foundation for the functioning of the World Organization, is at stake. The principle according to which, I quote, "the UN is based on the sovereign equality of states." Obeying this principle is aimed at guaranteeing respect for the legal rights and national interests of each country, regardless of the size of the territory, demographic, resource, and power potential. It is indicative that if we take the chronology and history of conflicts after the creation of the UN, after the confirmation of this principle unanimously approved by all, there was not a single conflict or crisis in which the West was guided by respect for the sovereign equality of states. I never invite you to look at the history of all the conflicts that have existed in the last 80 years, and such a position of the West has constantly aroused additional new crisis situations in international relations. Selectivity in the approach to the application of the principles of the UN Charter was particularly evident in the example of the Ukrainian crisis. We consider the emphasis on the principle of territorial integrity, which the West and the leaders of the UN Secretariat and other international structures do, on the full ignorance of the right of nations to self-determination. Let me remind you that it was the right of nations to self-determination that became the international basis of the process of decolonization, which brought freedom to a huge number of African countries, continents, and other regions of the world. The international community, by the way, has long since given an exhaustive answer to the seemingly legal collision between the principle of territorial integrity and the principle of the right of nations to self-determination. Back in 1970, after many years of negotiations, the UN General Assembly adopted a consensus on the principles of international law concerning friendly relations between states in accordance with the UN Charter. And in the part that we are talking about, it is clearly written there that it is necessary to respect the territorial integrity of all states, whose governments do not violate the principle of self-determination of nations, and therefore represent all the population living on this territory. Can the Kiev regime, which after the coup in February 2014 started a war against its own people, represent the population of Crimea? And did it represent the population of Crimea, the southeast and Ukraine after the coup. Of course not. Just as in the 1960s, the colonizers in London, Paris, Madrid, Lisbon, Berlin, Brussels could not represent the interests of the peoples of Africa, who wanted to live under the rule of governments elected by themselves, not imposed from the outside. The same story happened after the coup with huge territories of the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was the Nazi regime that came to power after the coup that for many years has brutally violated the rights of Russians and Russian-speaking people. And in recent years, somewhere since the mid-1910s, it has directly started the legislative extermination of everything related to the Russian world and Russia. Of course, Russian language, culture, traditions, Russian-speaking media, mass media, all this is legally prohibited. Last year, the law on the prohibition of canonical orthodoxy, the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, was adopted. Thus, another basic principle of the UN Charter, enshrined in Article 1 of the Charter of this organization, that all states are obliged to ensure human rights, regardless of race, sex, language, and religion. And it is evident that the West, which, for good or for bad, when dealing with the vast majority of the states represented here, is obligated to teach life from the point of view of human rights, compliance, in the Western understanding of this concept. But look, in recent years, after the coup, especially the statements of Western figures about Ukraine, the word combination of human rights has never been used at all. Moreover, Ursula von der Leyen and other Brussels bureaucrats and the NATO leadership, so to speak, publicly declare the need to build up Ukraine's support because Ukraine protects European values. It turns out that these values are the extermination of national identities, in this case of the Russian people, Russian-speaking people. And imagine, even in the Middle East, in Israel, the Arabic language is not prohibited. In the Palestinian territories, Hebrew is not prohibited. And the same thing happens in any other region of the world, where representatives of peoples, so to speak, who do not quite get along with each other, live together. And just recently, the Commissioner for the European Union for Expansion, some Ms. Coast, you can't remember them all, said proudly that Ukraine had fulfilled all the prerequisites that were necessary to start the process of negotiations on the annexation of Ukraine to the European Union, with those very European values that actually mean the embodiment in life of ideology, the embodiment in practice of the ideology of Nazism in its purest form. We started, including on the initiative of President Trump and with the support of the President of Turkey, the leadership of Saudi Arabia. We began direct contacts with Ukrainian representatives. On May 16th, direct negotiations on all issues of settlement were resumed in Istanbul, to which we had been ready for a long time. But Ukraine refused and was not allowed into this process, the owners, first of all, the leadership of today's Europe. At these negotiations on May 16th in Istanbul, when they resumed, We insisted on the cancellation of all these discriminatory laws. And we will continue to do this in the next round of direct negotiations, which we will announce in the near future. By the way, I would like to emphasize that for many years before the special military operation, and after it began, we offered and still offer the Ukrainian side to settle all the problems, and they are becoming more and more serious every year to settle them through dialogue and diplomacy. And I would like to express my gratitude to the governments that have provided their services for the resumption of negotiations without preconditions. Negotiations are better than war, but in order to succeed, and we are deeply convinced of this, it is necessary to eliminate the root causes of the conflict, as the President of Russia emphasized more than once. I have just mentioned one of them: the legislative deprivation of tens of millions of people of their right to their native language, traditions, culture, faith, history, in the end, in memory of their ancestors who lived on these lands for centuries, who founded cities, factories, built ports, and in general mastered these territories. And now these people who have created eastern Ukraine, the current South Ukraine, are demolishing monuments to the Kiev regime, including Catherine the Great, including her associates, as well as demolishing monuments to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War, who liberated Ukraine and then Europe from the Nazi plague. But there is another, no less important primary reason. It concerns the line to tighten Ukraine to NATO. I have repeatedly said that the trigger for the conflict in Ukraine, and in a broader sense, the deep crisis of Europe's security, was the aggressive expansion, the long-term expansion of NATO to the east, which was carried out contrary to the instructions of the USSR, and then Russia, with the sworn assurance of the Americans and Europeans that the NATO expansion would not take place. And all this became a violation not only of these promises, verbal, supposedly, promises, as some say, but it became a violation of the obligations signed at the highest level during the summits of the Security and Cooperation Organization in Europe in 1999, in Istanbul, and in 2010 in Astana. It was clearly stated there that security must be indivisible and equal, and that no country or group of countries has the right to claim dominance in the Aussie space, and NATO did exactly what was forbidden. And when we tried to question our Western colleagues, asking them why they violated what your presidents and prime ministers signed, we were told, well, this is a political declaration, and we will give legal guarantees of security only to those who apply to the North Atlantic Alliance at the request of the acceptance of members. This is such hypocrisy, such simple lies, without any exaggeration. And of course, we were forced to react, as President Putin has repeatedly said. We have repeatedly tried to translate the situation into Russian, negotiations on agreements on equal security, to consolidate this principle in practice. The West refused, including the last attempt in December 2021. And as President Putin said, we have no other choice but to defend the legal interests of the Russian Federation's security and the legal interests of the people whom we did not have the right to leave in the hands of the Nazi regime. As for membership in NATO, let me remind you that Ukraine's neutral, non-bloc, and non-nuclear status was solemnly declared in the Declaration on the Independence of this country, adopted in 1991. It was this obligation, the declaration of neutral, non-bloc and non-nuclear status for eternity, that made it possible for Ukraine to be recognized as an independent state by the Russian Federation and all other members of the international community. And the return to this solemn promise, which the Nazi regime tried to violate, and even wrote down this obligation to violate its non-nuclear status, wrote it down in the Constitution. The return to this obligation is one of the key requirements of Russia, which must be satisfied within the framework of any settlement, as it was provided in April 2022 at the negotiations in Istanbul, when this principle was recorded on paper. However, the negotiations were interrupted by the Anglo-Saxons and other organizers of the war against Russia. At the same time, they are not going to withdraw any lessons from this whole story. We are concerned about the growth of NATO contingents along the entire line of contact with Russia. By the way, this line has significantly extended after the reception of Sweden and Finland, which were once neutral to the alliance, and it is not clear why they were dissatisfied with their life in neutral status. In Europe, the voices of irresponsible politicians are heard more and more loudly, who urge the population to tighten their belts, prepare for war with Russia, and even name specific terms, either 2027 or 2030. The recent statements of Mr. Merz, the new German Chancellor, are very disturbing. He promised to turn Germany back into the leading military power in Europe, as he said. It immediately reminded many of the periods of the last century, when Germany became the first military power in Europe twice. What came of it? How much grief it brought to the people, and not only to the European continent. But this is not enough for NATO strategists. Now, NATO is taking steps to get out of its zone of responsibility, to strive for the Asian-Pacific region, which they began to call the Indo-Pacific region, threatening to undermine the security architecture that has developed around the ASEAN for many decades and has allowed the countries of the region and their partners from all over the world to cooperate successfully. This causes great concern for the fate of the ASEAN and for the future well-being of the member states of the ASEAN. When NATO members asked the former NATO General Secretary, "How come you have such plans in the Asian-Pacific region?" it seems that NATO is a defensive alliance that protects the territory of its member states. Stoltenberg, the former NATO General Secretary, did not hesitate to answer this question. He said, yes, we still protect the territory of the member states, but today the threat to these territories comes from the Indo-Pacific region, from the South China Sea, from the Taiwan Strait, from Southeast Asia. And you see how elements of NATO military infrastructure are being created there, including in their relationship between Washington and Seoul. Events are planned, including a nuclear component. 3 or 4 types are being created, such as South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia. They are trying to spread the AUKUS example to other closed, block-type configurations. They are openly trying to pull certain countries out of the dozens of ASEAN countries and make them part of their narrow block adventures in this region. And, of course, we are ready to show solidarity with our ASEAN friends in defending the architecture that was approved as part of the East Asian summits, and which are now trying to destroy. Historical experience shows that if NATO comes to you, wait for trouble. This is remembered in former Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, and in many other countries. The situation in the Middle East is particularly alarming. This strategically important region, as a result of the decades-long destructive line of Western players, is once again on the verge of destabilization. Today, we believe that it is still not too late to take urgent measures to de-escalate the situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone and to accelerate efforts to form conditions for the renewal of the negotiating process on all issues of final status, and to correct the historical injustice that has not yet allowed the creation of an independent Palestinian state. The situation around the Iranian nuclear program remains complex. After destroying the Joint Comprehensive Action Plan, when such a decision was made 8 years ago, separate circles in Israel, the United States, and Europe were hoping to terminate Tehran's legal, civilian nuclear development without considering its right to a non-disclosure agreement. We are now witnessing the negotiation process between Washington and Tehran, where this principle of the right to enrichment within the framework of the peaceful use of nuclear energy is key. Judging by the comments of the parties at the end of the next round, there is hope that progress will be made and that the process is moving in the right direction. We wish success to these efforts in the hope that the results will be achieved, which will satisfy all parties concerned, including, of course, Iran. In the message of the President of Russia to your High Assembly, the significance of the current year, as the year of the 80th anniversary of the defeat of German Nazism, Japanese militarism, and the creation, as a result of the Second World War, of a modern world order, of the central role of the United Nations. We stand for the creation of a global security architecture based on the objective trend of multipolarity, the emergence of new growth centers, and guaranteeing equal conditions for the peaceful development of all, without exception, states. The basis for this, I want to emphasize once again, is the UN Charter. It is only necessary that everyone fulfills it honestly. An important step towards this goal, towards the goal of global security, we believe is the formation of an architecture of equal and indivisible security on the Eurasian continent, the most extensive and rich, the stability of which depends on the stability of the multipolar world. At the same time, on the Eurasian continent, there is no general regional organization, unlike Africa, where there is the African Union, or Latin America, where there is CELAC. In this regard, President Putin has put forward the initiative to create an architecture of Eurasian security to participate in discussions on the construction of which all, without exception, states and the unification of the continent are invited, including the countries of the western part of Eurasia. In our opinion, this should be the Eurasian architecture, because the Euro-Atlantic concepts that have been tried on by the European part of the continent over the last many decades after the Second World War and during the Cold War, the Euro-Atlantic concepts have discredited themselves. NATO has violated all the commitments it has taken upon itself. The OSCE turned out to be non-functional due to the fact that Western countries and the leadership of the OSCE Secretariat refused to comply with the obligations attached to the documents, including the principle of consensus, impartiality, and much more. And the EU, after signing such a subordinate agreement with NATO a couple of years ago, essentially also joined the Euro-Atlantic schemes. Russia comes from the fact that what President Putin has already called a large Eurasian partnership is already being formed on our continent. This is manifested in the coordination of the integration processes that are underway in the Eurasian Economic Union. The Shanghai Organization cooperates with Russia as part of the China Initiative on the Belt and Road, as well as other sub-regional structures that exist, in particular, in the Persian Gulf and on the South Asian Peninsula. There are many sub-regional organizations here, and of course, the harmonization of these integration processes will allow us to form a solid material basis for discussions on security architecture. Russia does not impose anything on anyone. It is ready for a mutually respectful dialogue with everyone. And of course, we will improve the existing security mechanisms and use them in our work in the format of the Organization of the Collective Security Treaty, the already mentioned Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And we are promoting, within our bilateral ties with partners and allies, new principles that will contribute to the formation of a comprehensive continental architecture. In this regard, I will mention the agreements concluded in recent months on the guarantee of security between Russia and Belarus, between Russia and the Korean People's Democratic Republic, between Russia and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And of course, I would like to emphasize that all our steps and initiatives in a conceptual sense are in line with the position of the Global Security Initiative, which was put forward by China's chairman Xi Jinping, including the most important position that the key to resolving any conflicts in any part of the world is the establishment of the primary causes and their complete elimination. In the next step, we are considering the preparation of the Eurasian map of diversity and multipolarity in the 21st century. This document was proposed by Belarus and supported by Russia. It is intended to record the political and legal foundations of the interaction of the state and security in the Eurasian space and the parameters of cooperation in the entire multipolar world, based on the UN Charter in all its fullness and the interrelationship of its principles. Dear colleagues, Russia is determined to contribute to the resolution of common problems for all of humanity. Our initiative has taken the lead in promoting the principles of cooperation to ensure international information security. Based on the principle of sovereign equality, we have achieved, as the first step, the adoption of the UN Convention on Cybercrime in December last year, the first universal treaty in the sphere of international information security. We call on all countries to join this document. The signing ceremony will open in the fall of this year in the capital of Vietnam. We are convinced that the UN will be able to continue to increase efforts to agree on common universal criteria and principles to work in other areas, including in the field of artificial intelligence, which is now under hot debate. We are convinced that this topic should be considered by a group of government experts, states, members of the Convention on Non-Human Weapons. This convention and a group of experts are dedicated to discussing the problems of deadly autonomous systems. I cannot but mention the terrorism problem, which was mentioned in the film and in the message of the President of the Russian Federation. We are interested in increasing cooperation with everyone who does not divide terrorists into good and bad, and who does not resort to double standards. I would like to draw special attention to terrorism by the Kiev regime. The Kiev Special Services are involved in the murder of Russian politicians, military leaders, journalists, public figures. The regime loudly declares its plans to continue the massive shelling of civilian objects and the civilian population of the Russian Federation. It is very sad that the West reacts only to our legal, just and responsible measures against the terrorist actions of the Kyiv regime, which, I emphasize, target civilian targets, and our response measures are aimed exclusively at military targets and objects used by the armed forces of Ukraine. We will strive to ensure that everyone understands the essence of what is happening, and that the next attempt to fence out the Kiev regime for its direct involvement in terrorism is exposed. Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, will continue to act on the international stage and will be fully aware of its responsibility for all aspects of international relations, including maintaining peace, strategic stability, and resolving conflicts, and will promote a unifying agenda. I wish the participants of your meeting a fruitful discussion and success in your responsible work. Thank you.